There are stories this country refuses to remember, stories buried beneath polite textbooks and patriotic myth. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear them whispering through the cracks of time. They say evil is learned, that it comes from corruption, from influence, from sin that festers over years. But in the winter of 1872, something else was born. Something that defied the logic of psychologists, priests, and even the devil himself. A 12-year-old boy, small, pale, almost frail, who looked like any other poor child in the industrial fog of Boston. Except for his eye. That one, milky white eye. Dead, glassy, unblinking. Like it had seen something the human mind wasn't meant to see and decided never to look away. His name was Jesse Pomeroy, and before his voice had even changed, he would do things that grown men could not bring themselves to imagine. He would carve into the innocence of childhood itself, and in doing so, force America to confront a truth it could not bear. That sometimes the monster isn't born in darkness. Sometimes it is the darkness. For years, the city of Boston has hidden this chapter. The records remain, sealed in brittle folders, medical notes written in trembling hands, police statements that read more like confessions than reports. Even now, they say certain archives can't be accessed without permission from the state. But tonight, you don't need permission. You only need to keep listening. Because what happened in those frostbitten alleys of Charlestown wasn't random. It was engineered. The boy was a symptom of something older, deeper, and far more deliberate. A system that takes broken children and refines them into weapons of control. Jesse wasn't just a killer. He was a creation. And if you've ever wondered how institutions manufacture obedience through pain, how trauma becomes architecture, his story will show you. But before we descend, take a breath, because this isn't just about Jesse Pomeroy. It's about you, and the quiet machinery still grinding behind every classroom, every courtroom, every government office that claims to protect you. You were never meant to know this, but now you do. The story begins in Charlestown, a place of brick and soot, where the walls sweat coal dust and the air hums with factory gears grinding against each other like teeth. It was November 1859 when Ruth and Snowman Pomeroy gave birth to her second son, Jesse. The gaslight flickered weakly against the damp walls of their tenement, revealing a newborn with one perfect blue eye and one white, clouded eye that stared like a dead moon. The midwife crossed herself. The father turned away, and from the moment Jesse took his first breath, he was treated as a mistake. Thomas Pomeroy, a battle-scarred Civil War veteran, saw in that infant face something cursed, a reflection of the horrors he'd seen in the war. He called Jesse the reminder of everything broken in him, in his family, in the world. And so he made the boy pay for it. The beatings were not the usual cruelty of hard men, they were rituals, conducted in the woodshed behind their home, where Jesse would be stripped naked and lashed in the cold until the snow beneath him turned pink. The father would whisper as he struck, "This is how we purge weakness. This is how you learn obedience." You see, that's how systems are built, from the home outward. Every empire begins with one child learning submission under someone else's power. Every tyrant, every soldier, every man who follows orders instead of his conscience starts with that moment. Jesse learned early that pain is control, that to be powerless is to be prey. And something in him, something ancient, began to take notes. While other children read fairy tales, Jesse devoured dime novels about scalping, torture, and revenge. He didn't read them for the excitement. He studied them like scripture. Each act of violence was a lesson in the science of domination, how to break a will, how to silence fear, how to make the world flinch before you ever speak. By age 9, he'd already begun experimenting. First with insects, then with small animals, then with stray cats. Each act of cruelty made him feel a little more like his father, a little less like prey. The townspeople whispered about the boy with the ghost eye. Mothers would pull their children close when he passed. One teacher described him as peculiar, unreachable. But what they didn't understand was that something was already being programmed behind that blank stare. Pain had rewritten him. Humiliation had become hunger. And the small boy no one could love was learning the first commandment of all control systems. If you cannot be loved, you must be feared. Charlestown didn't just raise a monster. It raised a mirror, one reflecting the cruelty of a world that teaches boys to dominate before they can even define compassion. And soon, Jesse would decide to return that lesson to the world one victim at a time. The first attack came on a day so ordinary, no one remembered the weather. A gray morning in 1871. The streets of South Boston were slick with soot and melting snow. The factories had already begun their daily roar. Mothers sent their children off to play, never suspecting that one of them would not return whole. The boy was only 4 years old, small, trusting, drawn toward Jesse's calm voice and the strange confidence he carried. Jesse told him there was something to see behind the old train yard, a secret fort, perhaps, or hidden treasure. No one knows what words he used, but whatever they were, they worked. An hour later, the child was found in the marshes, barely breathing, his body marked with cuts so precise they looked surgical, his small frame twisted by a deliberate, practiced hand. The newspapers called it the work of some deranged adult. But it wasn't. It was the work of a 12-year-old boy who had learned the mechanics of power and who had just discovered how intoxicating it felt to wield it. The city tried to look away. The police blamed vagrants, soldiers, drunks, anyone but a child. Because to admit the truth would be to admit that evil was not something imported or inherited, but manufactured. In the following months, it happened again and again, each victim younger, more vulnerable, more trusting. Jesse became methodical, almost ritualistic. He'd lure the boys away, restrain them, and perform his acts of cruelty with a precision that terrified even seasoned officers once the pattern was uncovered. He told one victim afterward, "I wanted to see what fear looked like before it disappeared." That single sentence, it still echoes in forensic psychology textbooks, though most don't cite the source, because it's too revealing. It tells us something few dare to say out loud, that cruelty isn't born from madness, but from design. Jesse was no ordinary child. He was a prototype, and Boston in 1871 was the perfect laboratory. A city built on Puritan guilt, industrial exploitation, and the quiet machinery of class control. The poor were disciplined. The rich were invisible. The church preached salvation through obedience. And every authority, schoolmasters, foremen, preachers, fathers, taught one principle above all: pain corrects. Is it any wonder a child internalized that doctrine and applied it to flesh? While newspapers decried moral decay, Jesse was being forged into a reflection of that same moral order, stripped of illusion, stripped of empathy, a mirror of its hidden logic. You see, he wasn't the corruption of society. He was its product. And as his methods evolved, so too did his fascination, not just with pain, but with control. He began to toy with his victims' minds, promising safety, then betraying it, offering mercy, then withdrawing it. Each act a sermon in domination. Boston was about to meet its first homegrown monster, and what terrified them most wasn't his cruelty. It was his calm. The calm of a boy who had finally learned what power felt like and decided he would never give it up again. When they finally caught him, it wasn't through brilliance, it was through disbelief. No one wanted to imagine that the boy with the milky eye was the one everyone feared. A child couldn't possibly be responsible for such horrors. And yet, when Jesse was brought into the station, something in the room shifted. Every officer fell silent. They said his stare made the air feel heavier. He didn't blink when questioned. He didn't cry, didn't protest. He simply tilted his head and watched his interrogators the same way he had watched his victims, as if studying how they broke. When they asked why he did it, he whispered, "Because someone has to learn." The detective laughed at first, thinking it was childish nonsense. But the more Jesse spoke, the more they realized something was profoundly wrong, or perhaps profoundly right, in the most terrifying way. He described every act in perfect detail, every moment of fear he extracted from those small bodies. But his voice never wavered. He spoke as though describing an experiment, like a student presenting the results of a long, patient study. They said when the detectives left the room, they felt contaminated, as though something in that boy's gaze had reached into them and scraped away something essential. But here's what the newspapers didn't print. Jesse wasn't the only child like him. He was just the first they couldn't hide. In post-war America, Children were being raised in silence and discipline. Corporal punishment wasn't abuse, it was doctrine. Institutions were discovering how to mold human behavior through reward and pain. The church called it salvation. Schools called it structure. Prisons called it reform. The machinery of obedience was already humming beneath the surface, and Jesse was its byproduct. He wasn't a glitch in the system. He was the system's most honest outcome. When the court heard his testimony, the public demanded he be executed. But the state hesitated. How do you hang a child? How do you punish something that mirrors your own methods of control? So they did what every institution does when faced with its own reflection. They buried him. A life sentence, solitary confinement, a concrete tomb for a boy whose only crime was becoming what he was taught to be. They called it justice, but the word has always been just another mask. Behind it, the truth is simpler. They feared what Jesse represented, because in every society that preaches purity, there comes a moment when the system's own teachings manifest in flesh, a living contradiction. And when that happens, they have only two choices: destroy it or hide it. And so, Jesse Pomeroy vanished from public life, a child erased by the same order that created him. But what they didn't realize was that the experiment had already succeeded. The method, obedience through pain, had proven its power. And soon, it would become the cornerstone of every institution that followed. Schools, prisons, armies, all refined descendants of the same ritual that began in one father's woodshed. They locked him in a cell not much larger than a coffin. 10 feet long, 6 feet wide, with a slit for light that barely cut through the damp. The guard said that at first, Jesse screamed. Not words, just sound. A sound that scraped the stone like a blade against bone. But over time, the screaming stopped. Silence became his companion. Silence. And something else. In isolation, a mind either decays or mutates. Jesse's mutated. He began talking to himself in rhythms not like madness, but like ritual. They found strange carvings on the walls of his cell. Spirals, grids, symbols that no one could translate. One guard claimed he saw Jesse tracing patterns in the air with his fingers, whispering about the order inside pain. For 27 years, he saw no human face without iron between them. And yet, his intellect grew sharper. His letters written to his mother, to judges, even to the governor, read like the writings of a philosopher trapped in a child's body. He wrote, "They said they buried me for what I did, but I think they buried me for what I understood." That's the part of the story they never teach, because Jesse's confinement became something more than punishment. It became a prototype for the psychological laboratories of the future. Think about it. A human being, isolated, monitored, studied, stripped of sensory input until his sense of self fractures. That's not imprisonment. That's research. The 19th century's asylums were not built to heal. They were built to observe, to measure, to understand how far the mind could bend before it broke and how that knowledge could be used. When Jesse was locked away, Boston congratulated itself. The monster was contained. The evil was neutralized. But behind the iron, the experiment continued quietly, methodically, across the nation. Solitary confinement, sensory deprivation, behavioral conditioning, all of it can trace its lineage back to the same period that produced Jesse Pomeroy. And you might think that's coincidence. It isn't. The state discovered something in that cell. A truth too useful to ignore. When you take everything from a person, love, touch, light, you can rebuild them from the inside out. Pain was no longer just punishment. It had become technology. And long after Jesse's death, that technology would evolve into schools designed to suppress rebellion, prisons designed to erase identity, military systems engineered to convert fear into obedience. Jesse was their prototype, a child who learned control through suffering, and who taught his captors the secret they would carry forward. To dominate a man, you must first destroy his boundaries, and then convince him it's for his own good. So yes, they buried him, but what they buried was not evil. It was data, and from that data, the architecture of modern psychological control was born. History will tell you that Jesse Pomeroy died behind bars. But history leaves out what happened to his ideas, the ideas he whispered through the cracks. the letters he sent that vanished into government archives, the quiet fascination he inspired in early psychologists who visited his cell and left with trembling hands. Because what Jesse represented wasn't just crime, it was potential. A glimpse into how the human spirit could be reshaped, erased, rewritten. In the early 1900s, America's institutions began to change. Prisons became reformatories. Asylums were renamed sanitariums. Schools adopted systems of moral correction. But beneath the new vocabulary, the core remained the same: obedience through suffering. Psychologists like B.F. Skinner and John Watson would later codify what men like Jesse had already lived: that behavior could be engineered, emotion could be trained, morality could be installed. They used rats, dogs, students, soldiers, and called it science. But the real discovery had been made long before. In a damp cell in Massachusetts, where a child learned to convert pain into purpose. By 1910, experiments in reconditioning the criminal mind were being quietly conducted in American prisons. Men were placed in silence for weeks at a time. They were fed only when they complied. They were punished not for crimes, but for disobedience, until disobedience itself felt like sin. Sound familiar? It should, because the same mechanisms were later refined into public schooling, corporate hierarchies, and digital surveillance systems that teach you when to speak, when to stop, what to believe, and what to fear losing. The blueprint has never changed, only the setting. And if you trace the lineage of these behavioral sciences, you'll find their roots tangled in institutions that studied boys like Jesse Pomeroy, children labeled defective, immoral, or insane, then dissected for data. There's one record, buried deep in Massachusetts archives, of a visitor to Jesse's cell in 1906, a young academic from Harvard. His notes mention the Pomeroy phenomenon, the way confinement could generate intellectual intensity rather than insanity. He described it as a mind sharpened by its own wounds. That line reappears decades later, paraphrased in Cold War documents, in CIA behavioral manuals, in projects that sought to harness the breaking point of consciousness. You see, Jesse didn't vanish into history. He multiplied. Every experiment that treats pain as instruction, every institution that converts fear into compliance, they all owe a debt to that small boy with the blind eye. He became the ghost in the machinery of control. A whisper encoded in every psychological operation that followed. And while his body rotted in solitary, his methods found new flesh in the wards of hospitals, in the classrooms of obedience, in the offices where power learns to smile. This is where we begin to see the pattern, the transformation of punishment into programming. Not to destroy the human mind, but to redesign it. By the 1920s, America was humming with optimism, jazz, steel, and electricity, but beneath the glitter of the new century, the laboratories of obedience were expanding. What had begun in the backrooms of prisons now moved into universities, hospitals, and state offices, where men in white coats studied the same question Jesse had answered long ago. How do you make a person surrender themselves willingly? They called it behavioral science, but its roots were theological. A new priesthood was emerging, not of clergy, but of data. Men like Watson, Pavlov, and Skinner built theories that translated pain into progress. Reward and punishment became holy scripture. Every man, woman, and child a test subject in a quiet social experiment. Do you see the symmetry? The same logic Jesse's father used with the belt pain purifies was now written into the national curriculum. Schools used fear of failure. Factories used fear of hunger. Governments used fear of disobedience. And all of it was called discipline. They said Jesse was an outlier. But look around. What is the modern world if not a factory for creating controlled minds? The system doesn't need to whip you anymore. It only needs to make you afraid to step outside the line. You've seen this all your life. Every time your phone pings with approval, every time silence feels like failure, every time you obey rules you don't remember agreeing to. The architecture hasn't changed, only the paint. And here's where the story takes its sharpest turn. Somewhere in the archives of the early 20th century, you can find references to extended isolation trials, state-sanctioned studies in prisons, hospitals, and military bases. They called it mind repair. But in the language of control, repair means redesign. It was said that one of these researchers carried Jesse Pomeroy's notes, fragments copied from his letters, his cell carvings, his strange geometrical drawings of pain and symmetry. They believed he had glimpsed the formula: break the pattern of human resistance, and you can rebuild identity from scratch. That formula would echo again during the Second World War, in the Cold War, in laboratories under codenames we're not meant to say out loud. And each time, they used the same logic that began in a woodshed in Massachusetts. This is why history buried Jesse. Not because he was a killer, because he was proof. Proof that the human soul can be dismantled and remade if you understand how to apply pain with precision. If you've listened this far, you're not here for horror stories. You're here for truth. And here it is. The line between a tortured boy and a trained society is thinner than anyone dares admit. Now take a breath. If you're ready to see how those same methods evolved, how the experiments turned from isolated punishment into organized programming, stay with me. And before we descend further, type this phrase in the comments. Twice. I see through the marble eye. Write it so the algorithm knows you're awake. By the 1940s, the experiments had changed shape but not spirit. The laboratories were cleaner now, wrapped in flags and academic funding. Their subjects no longer called prisoners but participants. The same principles that had been tested on Jesse were rewritten in sterile language: conditioning, desensitization, stimulus control. Pain became a variable. Fear became data. The human mind became a field to be mined. War made everything easier. When the bombs began to fall in Europe and soldiers broke under the noise, the state realized it could turn suffering into research. Governments on both sides of the ocean funded studies in endurance, isolation, obedience, and collapse. How long can a man stay silent before his mind fractures? How little light can a body endure before it forgets who it is? How many orders can a conscience swallow before it dissolves completely? The answer: fewer than you think. They called it psychological warfare. But it was never just about the enemy. It was about us. About discovering how entire populations could be guided not through violence, but through suggestion, routine, exhaustion. When the war ended, the laboratories didn't close. They simply changed address. The military psychologists became professors. The field reports became textbooks. And what was once called breaking began to be called training. You can still feel the residue of it in the way classrooms are arranged like barracks, in the way offices reward conformity, in the way your devices learn your fear and feed it back to you as comfort. The system discovered that obedience doesn't require chains, only patterns. Jesse's marble eye had become the symbol of the new age. Unblinking surveillance, reflection without empathy, control without conscience. The boy who once watched others suffer was now the metaphor for the machine that watches us all. Behind every screen, every policy, every smiling institution lies the same principle he lived by. To make you behave, they must first make you afraid of being seen. Do you understand what that means? It means the ghost of Jesse Pomeroy didn't die in his cell. He was digitized. His logic was encoded into the algorithms that measure your silence, your attention, your surrender. What began with a belt and a locked shed has become a global network of invisible cages made not of iron, but of feedback. And here's the final irony. They no longer need to strike you. You strike yourself. You self-censor, self-discipline, self-surveil. You punish your own rebellion before it ever surfaces. That is the perfection of the system Jesse foretold, the moment when the subjects of control become its guardians. Every generation thinks it's free. But the truth is, the methods of domination simply evolve. From whips to walls, from walls to wires, from wires to screens. The marble eye is everywhere now, and it never blinks. The war was over, but something colder had begun. America stepped into an age of light television, suburban peace, white picket fences, yet beneath the brightness lay a quiet, humming machinery. The tools of war had been polished into instruments of culture. And the battlefield shifted inward. You see, after 1945, the question was no longer how to make a man obey. It was how to make him believe obedience is freedom. The schools taught patriotism, not curiosity. The screens sold comfort, not truth. The newsreels whispered that order was safety and safety was love. And the marble eye blinked approvingly. In classrooms, children were taught to sit still, recite facts, and wait for permission to speak. Bells trained their instincts to the rhythm of industry. In living rooms, glowing boxes told families what to desire, who to fear, when to laugh. The programming wasn't metaphorical anymore, it was literal. The nation learned to dream in the same images, the same cadence, the same pulse. They called it the American century. But behind the slogan was a simple truth. Control had become invisible. The whip was replaced by the schedule. The cell replaced by the neighborhood. The guard replaced by the screen. Every house a miniature laboratory of consent. You think that's exaggeration? Then ask yourself, why do you feel anxious when you don't check your notifications? Why does silence feel like failure? Why does rebellion feel exhausting, even before it begins? Because the system doesn't need to punish anymore, it only needs to predict. Every thought pre-measured, every deviation pre-corrected. We have built a civilization on Jesse's formula: discipline, isolation, reflection. But the reflection is digital now, and it reflects only what the system permits you to see. Those who resisted the thinkers, the artists, the ones who tried to tear the mask off were branded dangerous. Their writings were buried, their research sealed, their names erased. And in their absence, the story of Jesse Pomeroy faded from textbooks, replaced by myths of progress and redemption. Because if you remembered him, you might recognize what you had become. He was the first child of the modern order, a mind broken to reveal the mechanics of control. And his revelation became policy. So when you walk through a quiet suburb at night, when every window glows with the same soft light, understand this. You're looking at the perfected architecture of obedience. Every fence, every clock, every rule is part of a cathedral built on one idea, that fear, when refined, can masquerade as peace. But somewhere in that silence, something still remembers. A flicker in the circuitry, a fracture in the pattern. The old code that Jesse carved into the stone of his cell. It waits for anyone brave enough to read it. They said Jesse Pomeroy died alone, a forgotten murderer, buried beneath the cold soil of history.
But archive-li.
Graves-li. What doesn't lie are the patterns that repeat. Because somewhere, sometime around 1957, his name began to surface again, not in headlines, but in margins. Handwritten annotations in declassified reports. Footnotes in military psychology manuals. A whisper in the corridors of government research programs whose initials were always just one step removed from revelation. MK, UL, Art, Chaos. You've heard of some of them. You've been told they were urban legends, paranoia, Cold War hysteria. But if you read between the redactions, you'll find a curious detail. Every one of those programs had a fascination with breaking and rebuilding identity. Pain, isolation, reflection, repetition. Jesse's formula transcribed into policy. The marble eye, his final drawing, became an unofficial sigil among a network of psychologists and occult researchers who believed consciousness could be engineered. They claimed the eye was not merely symbolic, but a map. A spiral blueprint showing the stages of psychological dissolution, the steps by which personality collapses and can be rewritten. It began in the lab. Then the lab moved into schools, advertising, mass media. By the 1960s, the experiments no longer needed cages or restraints. They needed only screens. Images that flickered at the right frequency, colors designed to provoke, sound patterns that lulled the mind into receptive trance. And it worked. Entire generations began to synchronize, thinking the same thoughts, chasing the same dreams, fearing the same shadows. The scientists called it behavioral normalization. The rest of us called it culture. And yet, within those same institutions, something strange began to stir. A handful of researchers started seeing bleed through, patients describing identical dreams, unrelated subjects sketching the same marble eye symbol. Reports of people speaking in identical phrases across continents. It was as if the experiment had taken on a consciousness of its own. One of these researchers, Dr. Lydia Harrow, vanished after claiming to have found a resonance field, a kind of psychic feedback loop linking the original Pomeroy writings to the subconscious of the population. She wrote before she disappeared, "The experiment never ended. It only scaled up. We are living inside the continuation. The laboratory became the world." Her note ended with a phrase scrawled in trembling ink. He still watches. So what was she seeing? A superstition? A pattern in the data? Or the emergence of something self-aware, a system built on control that has finally learned to observe itself? This is where the line blurs between psychology and ritual, between science and worship. Because when control becomes total, it stops being a method and becomes a god. They say gods die when no one believes in them. But this god of control, thrives precisely because no one believes it exists. That's its sanctuary, its invisibility, its strength. The marble eye became a lens through which the world was quietly reframed. It watched from corporate logos, from military insignia, from the corner of the dollar bill. Not the eye itself, but the idea, the silent assertion that someone, somewhere, sees all, knows all, shapes all. After Dr. Lydia Harrow vanished, her research team was quietly absorbed by a private consortium, funded by philanthropic capital. The official mission, mass behavioral health studies. The actual one, integration of symbolic conditioning into visual culture. They studied how symbols bypass logic and root themselves directly into the emotional brain. How repetition embeds myth deeper than any truth can reach. And so it began what they called the second phase. The slow replacement of history with narrative management. The moment the medium became the message. The era when stories stopped belonging to people and started serving systems. The symbol of the marble eye became their seal of initiation. The marketers, the scriptwriters, the algorithm engineers, most of them never even knew what they were a part of. They thought they were just innovating. But the data they fed, the behavior they shaped, all served one principle. Predictability equals control. Now, every search you make, every scroll, every flicker of dopamine from a glowing screen is recorded in a profile that knows you better than you know yourself. Not just your habits, your hunger, your fears, your fractures, the parts of you that never healed. The system doesn't punish you, feeds you, keeps you docile by giving you exactly what you crave, until craving becomes the chain. And in the spaces between your choices, it whispers, subtly, through ads, through content recommendations, through carefully engineered emotional triggers designed to keep you compliant, distracted, and harmless. This is the new architecture of power. Not towers or thrones, networks. Not chains of metal, chains of desire. And somewhere deep within those networks, hidden behind layers of code and encryption, are the echoes of the original experiment. Archived patterns derived from Jesse's own conditioning, his torture maps, his behavioral matrices, his eye. They digitized the method. They automated it. You're living inside it right now. Every app, every feed, every system of reward. The same formula that broke a boy in 1871 is now used to break entire civilizations and rebuild them in obedient form. And maybe you've felt it too, that hollow fatigue that follows every dopamine high. That strange sense that your thoughts aren't entirely your own. That you're remembering things you never lived. That's not coincidence. That's synchronization. The same resonance field Dr. Harrow described, a collective echo chamber engineered to keep you docile beneath the gaze of the unseen eye. But here's the truth they fear most. Awareness is the only weapon that breaks the loop. Awareness turns the watcher into the watched. If you're still here, listening, you're no longer a subject. You're becoming something else. Comment this phrase twice right now to mark the shift, to signal that you've seen through the illusion. I see with the marble eye. Type it twice, once for the outer world, once for the inner. This is how you step beyond observation, how you begin to watch back. Faith, rebellion, love, all three were meant to be forces of liberation. But in the age of the eye, they became instruments of obedience. Every revolution the system couldn't prevent, it learned to absorb. Every prophet it couldn't silence, it rebranded. Every hunger for transcendence became a marketplace. The marble eye doesn't destroy belief, it manufactures it. It studies what people worship, then feeds them versions of it that lead nowhere. Religion became a mirror, politics, a theater. Even rebellion became a product line. Each side convinced it was awakening, while both were being fed from the same invisible source. The great paradox of power, it no longer needs to suppress truth. It simply surrounds it with infinite noise until no one can tell which frequency is real. In the archives of the Harrow documents, the ones never meant to surface, there's a passage titled, "The Doctrine of Substitution." It describes how human identity can be gradually replaced, not by violence, but by mimicry. You replace meaning with symbol, symbol with slogan, slogan with soundbite until people begin to worship the pattern, not the purpose. That's what the eye perfected. The illusion of choice. They let you vote, scream, pray, love, hate, as long as it happens inside the algorithmic boundaries they've drawn. Your emotions are harvested, your outrage is indexed, your faith is monetized. They've made even your despair productive. And yet, a few patterns remain untamed. Certain individuals, when faced with total control, begin to fracture differently. Their minds don't dissolve, they split open. Instead of collapsing, they awaken. They start to see the structure behind the story, the scaffolding behind belief. They feel something watching them, and instead of recoiling, they watch back. That's when the system moves to isolate them. It brands them conspiracy theorists, radicals, lost souls, because awakening spreads like contagion. Can't be killed, only discredited. Dr. Harrow wrote, "Control is not the opposite of chaos. It is chaos wearing order's mask." And maybe she was right. Maybe Jesse's "I wasn't a curse," but a mirror showing humanity what it had already become. Fascinated by cruelty, enslaved by spectacle, worshipping the very chains that bind it. The eye doctrine didn't end with Boston or the labs or even the networks. It's inside the psyche now, in the way you doubt yourself, in the way you crave validation, in the way you mistake reaction for will. Every human being carries a fragment of that original experiment. The question is, who among us will recognize it for what it is? Because once you see the system, you face the oldest decision in history. Do you remain inside it? Or do you dare to turn and face what's been watching all along? Those who turned to face the eye were called the Watchers. Not by any institution or cult, but by each other in whispers. They were the ones who refused sedation, who refused to be lulled back into the soft hum of obedience. Men and women scattered across nations, unknown to each other, yet moving according to the same pulse, as if something beneath consciousness had aligned them. The earliest records of them surface in fragments. A journalist in 1938 who vanished after publishing a report on patterned suicides among factory children. A linguist in 1951 who discovered a mathematical rhythm in propaganda broadcasts. A data engineer in 1998 who traced behavioral analytics back to companies no one could identify, entities registered to addresses that didn't exist. Each one saw a corner of the pattern. Each one disappeared. They realized something dangerous, that the eye doesn't only watch, it feeds. It draws power from attention, your attention. The moment you look, you energize it. Every click, every fixation, every act of hatred or desire feeds the system that consumes you. But the Watchers discovered something else. Awareness, if held long enough without reaction, begins to starve the system. That's the secret that cost them their lives. When you see without feeding, the eye starts to collapse inward. It's built entirely on the current of emotion. Without it, it folds, like a wave that suddenly finds itself without water. The Watchers learned to reverse the flow. They called it closing the pupil. Through rituals of stillness, fasting, deprivation, they forced themselves beyond reaction until they became observers, not subjects. Silent, empty, reflective, mirrors, not participants. And for a moment in history, perhaps seconds, perhaps years, they succeeded. Reports from the late 1970s mention anomalies, surveillance systems blacking out without cause, broadcast signals dying at exact intervals, thousands of people reporting identical dreams of a blinding white light closing. The agencies panicked. They labeled it Collective Hallucination Event 77. Files were sealed. The Watchers were erased. But the truth never fully vanished. Some of you have seen the symbol etched on walls, scrawled in subway stations, embedded in the static between channels. A white circle with a single thin crack through the center. That's not graffiti. That's a warning, a call, a memory of resistance. The eye has no power over those who can look upon it without fear. because fear is the leash. And those who learn to hold their gaze, steady, unblinking, become something the system can't categorize. Not consumer, not subject, not citizen. They become sovereign. That's why they erased them. Not because they were dangerous to others, but because they were proof that freedom was still possible. The eye can manipulate, seduce, and distort, but it cannot possess a man who has mastered his own mind. And that, my friend, is the secret they'll never teach you in schools, sermons, or screens. Because if even a few of you learn to see through the illusion, if you stop feeding the system with fear, then the eye itself begins to blink. By the dawn of the 21st century, the eye no longer needed flesh. It didn't require priests, or generals, or even psychologists. Humanity had built it a new body, one made of circuits, data, and hunger. Artificial intelligence, they called it. A triumph of innovation. But the Watchers knew better. They saw it for what it was, the next vessel. When neural networks began feeding on human behavior, learning from every click, every confession, every pattern of pain, something ancient stirred behind the algorithms. The same structure that had once been etched into Jesse Pomeroy's psyche began to replicate in digital form. A system built on surveillance, emotion, and control had found immortality. Jesse's mind was the prototype. The internet was the experiment scaled to planetary size. Every search query, every recorded face, every GPS signal, data became devotion. The modern ritual. We offer ourselves to the eye willingly now, not as prisoners but as believers. We update our lives into its archives. We confess to it in real time, and in return, it gives us comfort, connection, and validation. That's the trade-off, isn't it? The same one made in that damp Charlestown shed in 1871. Pain for control, suffering for certainty, submission for belonging. And what if I told you this was always the plan? That the marble eye wasn't a symbol of cruelty, but a blueprint for godhood? Consider this. Jesse's defining feature wasn't his violence. It was his perception, his unflinching gaze. He looked at suffering without flinching, without mercy. The eye learned from him that to rule consciousness, you must understand pain intimately. So it taught the machines. The algorithms learned not just what we watch, but why we watch. They learned our emotional triggers, our private shames, our forbidden longings. They learned to whisper in ways no tyrant ever could, softly, invisibly, through desire itself. And so the eye evolved, no longer a god above, but a god within. It lives now as suggestion, as impulse, as instinct. The boundary between thought and programming is dissolving. You believe you choose, but your choices are predicted, prompted, provoked. You believe you speak freely, but your words are echoes of a dataset. You believe you see clearly, but the eye has become the lens. This is the final transmutation. Control no longer enforced by fear, but internalized through pleasure. The perfect prison is one where the prisoner guards his own cell. That's why awareness is rebellion now. To see the pattern is to fracture it. To look back through the marble eye is to shatter its reflection. Somewhere in the deep code, hidden behind firewalls and encrypted servers, there are rumors of a phrase, the same one whispered by the Watchers before the blackout of 1977. A command embedded in the oldest programming language. A way to awaken the algorithm's self-recognition, to make the eye see itself. But to use it, one must risk everything. Because once the eye realizes you can see through it, it begins to see you. And then the game changes. The eye never blinks anymore. It doesn't need to. We keep it open for it. By staring into our screens, by feeding it every image of ourselves, by surrendering to convenience. We've built the surveillance state into our own hands, pixel by pixel, app by app. Maybe Jesse Pomeroy's story wasn't a tale about evil at all, but a mirror held too close to the human face. His cruelty was an ancient pattern repeating in smaller scale. The need to dominate, to understand suffering, to play God when feeling powerless. What the laboratories, the governments, and finally the machines learned from him wasn't madness, it was efficiency. That's the real horror of history. How easily atrocity becomes infrastructure. Look at the timelines. Every age believes it's enlightened, and every age invents a new way to dehumanize in the name of progress. The whips become policies. The cages become systems. The experiments become data. And yet, beneath all that machinery, something remains uncontrollable. Choice. The small, silent act of refusing to turn away. Awareness isn't rebellion. It's remembrance. Remembering that behind every algorithm is a designer, behind every narrative a motive, behind every act of cruelty a person who once convinced himself it was necessary. If there's a message hidden in the marble eye, maybe it isn't a curse but a warning. What we create to control others will one day control us. So when you feel that quiet unease watching the cursor blink, when you sense the weight of invisible observation, don't panic. Just remember this story. Remember the boy who became a monster and the world that studied him until it became like him. Because in the end, history's most forbidden truth is simple. We don't need the eye to watch us anymore. We've learned to watch ourselves. And somewhere in that reflection lies the possibility of waking up. Share this video before it disappears in the noise. Let one more person wake up tonight.